Good evening and welcome to our lecture this evening. And it's really a very special occasion, a very special pleasure for me to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Katy Hull. Katy is lecturer in American Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She is a graduate of Oxford University, where she did modern history. She graduated from Oxford with a double first in that subject. And I would also like to point out that she is a distinguished member of the class of 2002, if memory serves, of the Bologna Center. And while she was in Bologna, she was the recipient of the Grove Haynes Prize, which you may have heard of. That is a prize given for the best essay of the year in international relations. She won in that category. Actually, it was on a paper that she wrote on US relations with Indonesia, which was her interest at the time, one of her interests. Katy has a PhD in history from Georgetown University, and she's going to talk tonight about the book. The talk is based at least on the book that has grown out of her PhD dissertation. The name of the book, intriguingly, The Machine Has a Soul, just published by Princeton University Press. The Machine Has a Soul, American Sympathy with Italian Fascism. The title of her talk is similar, more simple and direct: Why Americans Loved Mussolini. And welcome, Katy. Katy is coming to us, although she teaches in Amsterdam. She's coming to us from her current base of operations in Vienna. Welcome, Katy. And it's hard not to be struck, by the way, by the timeliness, both of your book and of your talk here tonight. So over to you. Talk as long as you'd like, but no longer than 45 minutes.
Okay.
We will open it up for questions. And as you know, you have, those of you who are listening, you can use the Q&A function to send me questions. And then we will go to the Q&A session as soon as Katy's done. Katy, over to you.
Hi, John. And thanks for having me. And obviously, my only sadness is that I'm not there in person, but needs must, and we will make do. As John said, my talk today is titled Why Americans Loved Mussolini. And I'll point to three main reasons. First would be that Mussolini presented a form of masculinity that was appealing to Americans. Second, that the Italian corporate state appeared to offer a solution to some of the problems inherent to democracy. And third, and this was particularly during the Great Depression, fascism seemed to offer effective policies which not only enabled economic recovery, but also suggested that it was possible to recalibrate the modern economy. And in all these areas, fascism appeared to be better adapted to the challenges of modernity. And what I mean by that is something I'll explain over the course of my presentation, and we can talk about more in conversation as well. As John mentioned, pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about today is a distillation of my recent book that was published by Princeton University Press last month. And given that the title is intriguing, maybe, a little obscure, maybe, I think it's probably a good time to explain that now. So something that I noticed in my research was that all of the American fans of fascism whom I studied were really deeply concerned about the impact of modernity on the United States. And they often talked about how the machine in its various forms affected Americans. Sometimes they'd be talking about quite literal machines, and sometimes they'd be using the image of the machine as a sort of metaphor for modern life. And so they argued that mechanization robbed men of their essential masculinity, that technology interfered with democratic process, and that mechanical production had produced a major economic crisis. But on top of that, and behind that, and those sort of more tangible criticisms, they frequently describe American modernity as soulless and soul-sucking. And what they so admired in fascism wasn't that it signified a rejection of modernity or a simple return to a traditional way of life, but rather that it appeared to be using machinery and updated processes in ways that edified the lived experiences of ordinary people. And the title of the book itself, The Machine Has a Soul, came from the writing of Richard Washburn-Child, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a minute. But Child quoted Mussolini as saying that fascism's goal wasn't just to have a machine that would run, but was to create a machine that would run and had a soul. And for me, when I read that quotation, it was a bit of a light bulb moment, because I'd already found a lot of evidence running through the sources that I'd read that American fascist sympathizers were very ambivalent about American modernity, and that they thought that Italy was doing a better job. But when I read these words, it sort of hit something that I'd sensed but hadn't yet been able to articulate for myself. And I felt that I had a title, at least, for the book, and something of a thesis behind it. So I'll be discussing these three dimensions: the gender dimension, the institutional dimension, and also the economic policy dimension. But before that, I'll just go into some detail about the methodology of my book, which is based on 4 interlocking biographies of 4 different American fascist sympathizers. So I'll give you a little sense of each of those people first. And the first is this guy, the ambassador Richard Washburn-Child, who was US ambassador to Italy between 1921 and 1924. Before that, he'd worked as a political operative on Warren Harding's presidential campaign, and the ambassadorship was his reward for work that he'd done on that campaign. Child arrived in Italy as its elected liberal government was in turmoil, and in 1922 he witnessed the fascist squads marching on Rome. And he described that takeover, which was, after all, an illegal overthrow of a democratically elected government, as, and this is a quote, a fine young revolution. By 1924, Child had returned to the US, and he took up a position as a journalist at the Saturday Evening Post, which was the nation's preeminent weekly magazine. It had the largest circulation of any magazine in the US at the time, and it was very much a voice of sort of middle America conservative values. And then one last thing I'd say about Child is that in 1928, he took the job of editing Mussolini's first English language autobiography. The second person I consider in some detail is the journalist Anne O'Hare McCormick, who was very much a self-made woman. She was of Irish origins and became a journalist for the New York Times. But the Times in the 1920s was a really difficult place for women to get a journalist's job. So McCormick herself got this job by negotiating a freelance position with the Times, so they didn't even need to pay for her travel, for her reports. But she was such an incredibly talented journalist and a really wonderful writer. And by dint of her talent, she went from strength to strength at the Times. By the mid-30s, she was really the newspaper's principal authority on issues of foreign policy. And in 1936, the Times editorial board appointed her onto the board, she was the first woman to ever serve in that position, and actually the first foreign policy journalist ever to serve in that position. And given her position, she had access to a lot of leaders. She interviewed Mussolini on a number of occasions. She also interviewed Hitler once, and she had a strong relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. The third person is a man who was both a political power broker for the Democratic Party and a very powerful businessman and newspaper publisher. His name was Generoso Pope. He'd come to the US with the proverbial $10 in his pocket, according to family law. And he made his way up through New York society, working first as a manual laborer, going on to own a cement company, and finally monopolizing New York City's entire cement and gravel industry in the late 1920s, which obviously coincided with a massive construction boom. So by the late 1920s, he was an extraordinarily wealthy man, and he used just a tiny portion of this wealth to buy a number of Italian language newspapers in the States, including Il Progresso Italo-Americano, which was the widest circulating Italian language newspaper. And by virtue of his role as a publisher, Pope had made himself a very influential voice in Italian American politics and within the Democratic Party, both as a way of getting out the vote and directing it towards Democratic candidates. And then the fourth and final person was an intellectual and an academic. His name was Herbert Wallace Schneider. And Schneider was deeply influenced by the pragmatic philosopher John Dewey, whom he wrote his PhD with. And he also had a lot of support from a very influential political scientist called Charles Merriam. And with friends like that in these relatively high places, Schneider got a number of fellowships, for instance, from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to go and research and teach in fascist Italy. So that's a small overview of those people. I'll just say an extra word or two about why I chose them and not someone else. About 10 years ago, while I was doing my PhD, I read John Diggins's Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America. And Diggins himself was an intellectual historian who died a few years ago. And the book was published in the early 70s, also by Princeton. It's a really brilliant book. And one of Diggins's contributions was that he demonstrated quite decisively that fascist sympathies were either unique to liberal Americans or unique to conservative Americans. So in that way, he kind of complemented the work of European historians who'd already demonstrated that fascism doesn't belong strictly to the tradition of the American left or the American right. Something that Diggins does very well is he gives this huge overview of hundreds of different voices of fascists, sympathizers and opponents to Italian fascism in the United States. And I really wanted to build on his study. And one way I could do that was to provide sort of much deeper biographical insights into a few people, because he covered so many people, he couldn't give those kind of deep insights into any single individual. And one thing that I really missed when I was reading his work was more insight into what these people thought about the United States. He gave a lot of impressions about what they thought about Italy, but not such a sort of deep and prolonged sense of what they thought about the US. So I settled on these individuals for a few reasons. First, because I wasn't interested in challenging Diggins's basically sound observation that Americans had come from across the political spectrum to sympathize with fascist Italy. Other people have challenged that assertion, and it's pretty noteworthy that their scholarship is a lot less rigorous and a lot more politically motivated. So from the conservative and arch-conservative right, you have people like Jonah Goldberg and Dinesh D'Souza, who've asserted this inextricable link between American progressivism and European fascism. And then less known, but from the left, you have the Italian journalist Ennio Carretto, who's insisted that fascist sympathies are much more a product of American conservatism. And I think what's noteworthy both in Goldberg and D'Souza's work, as well as Ennio Carretto, is that when you look at their sources, they actually all go back to Dickens. But what they're doing with Dickens is sort of telling less than half of the story that Dickens himself had already told. So for me, it was important to pick people from across the political spectrum, including Child, who was a conservative Republican for most of his career, Pope, who as I've indicated, had strong ties with the Democratic Party, McCormick, who was very strongly influenced by ideas of Catholic social justice, so had progressive instincts herself, and Schneider, who was essentially agnostic, at least when it came to domestic political party politics. And then something else that informed my selection of people was that I really wanted to pick people who had influence, who were very much part of mainstream American culture and politics, and part of the establishment in a sense. And these people indeed they worked for the biggest newspapers, magazines and journals, and they had access to well-placed people in governments in both Italy and the United States. And part of why I was interested in that was sort of to look for direct influence in terms of policy and policy making, but it was also more of a cultural exploration to see how much their ideas gelled with ideas that were also circulating in American politics and culture in the 20s and 30s. So that's how I came to these four. And I think I'm more or less at a point now where I've kind of given you guys the overview of these four individuals and what brought me to them. And I'll go now into a little bit more detail about these three principal concepts of why they admired fascism, looking at the cultural dimension, if we define gender as largely a cultural thing, the institutional dimension, looking at democratic politics, and then the policy dimension, looking at economic policy reforms during the New Deal. And I would just note that most of the observations I'm making pertain to a decade-long time period, from about the mid-20s to the mid-30s. My book itself actually stretches a little longer. It begins in the early 1920s with the rise of the fascist squads and goes through to the eve of the Second World War. So maybe in Q&A, people have questions that pertain to either that earlier period or to the mid to late 1930s, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. So I'll discuss some of these gender-based reasons as to why Americans admired Mussolini first. And a lot of gender theorists have shown us that during times of economic transition and cultural dislocation, men often develop a sense of imperiled masculinity. The 1920s was one of those times, and commentators worried very much about the role of the transition to an industrial economy and a consumer-based economy on gender roles and specifically on manhood. So after he left his position of ambassador in Italy, Richard Washburn-Child published books and wrote articles that described the impact of industrialization on American men. And Child's basic point here was that the shift from an artisanal culture to an industrial one, in which men performed repetitive tasks for a fixed wage, had eroded manly ideals of responsibility and autonomy. And so the criticism here was that by no longer using their creative and discretionary powers, the average American man had become little more than a machine. An accompanying discourse suggested that average American men had things too easy. So for instance, Anna McCormick, the New York Times journalist, wrote a series of articles about the Florida land boom in 1925. And she described the ease with which men could now make money. she argued that a man's character didn't matter anymore in America, that he barely needed to lift his finger to make a profit, and that he could spend his easily earned cash on all manner of mass-produced mail-order goods. So what McCormick was pointing to here was a sort of huge shift in ideas of manhood, because in the late 19th century, men had been defined not as consumers, which was considered a sort of feminine quality, but as producers. And that the traits that were most valued in men weren't external factors such as being fashionable, but more internal marks of character. So these observers imagined Mussolini as the counter to the automated and vacuous American man. So whereas their American men lacked autonomy, they conceived of Mussolini as driven by his own internal will. And whereas the new American man was a consumer, they stressed that Mussolini had no interest in any form of consumption. So for instance, they would even go into details about how he ate very simple food and how he didn't drink and never smoked. And here they were really very consciously constructing him as an archetype of Victorian or late 19th century manhood. And in other ways, they emphasized that Mussolini was the mirror image of the average American man. So for instance, McCormick first interviewed him in 1926, and she stressed how calm Mussolini was and what a good listener he was. And that was in sort of very distinct contrast from her journalism from Florida, which had positively rattled with this sense of a society that was speeding out of control and of men who were mindlessly riding the wave. So her journalism from Italy conveyed this sense of someone who was very much in control of the pace of change. But that's not to say that these observers didn't think that Mussolini's Italy was changing. So it wasn't at all the case that they constructed him simply as an old-fashioned man in a very old-fashioned country. Rather, they conceived of him as someone who was purposefully and consciously modernizing his country. So for instance, McCormick described how Mussolini explained with great clarity the complex organization of his new state. And similarly, Child described how Mussolini could balance complex numbers in his head and make easy sense of other demanding issues of modern governance. So what they were describing here was a man who really navigated the complexity of modernity without losing his sense of self. And this image here of Mussolini really struck me because it's the portrait that occurred by far the most often in Generoso Pope's newspaper, Il Progresso. And it was really consistent with the kind of Mussolini that Pope and other American fascist sympathizers wanted to convey, which was a man who was very self-contained, very calm, and actually quite alone. And this is the photograph that appears at the front of Mussolini's autobiography, which Richard Washburn-Child edited. And I think it also conveys someone who's both alone and self-determined. And if we compare that here to this image, which is from an advertisement in the Saturday Evening Post, but it's very consonant with a lot of images you see in American magazines from the 20s. And these are sort of images of men being pushed along by the crowd and by the sheer speed of modern life. We have a sort of real sense of the difference in these conceptions of manhood. One is externally driven and pushed by the group, and another where aloneness is a sign of strength and a mark of character. And I think a final feature of these photos is their religious and spiritual connotations. And other historians, so for instance, Emilio Gentile, have pointed out how the fascists appropriated religious imagery and rituals. And so this portrait of Mussolini, at least for an Italian-American audience and an Italian audience, would have been quite reminiscent of the kind of portraits they saw of saints. But the second image, I think, has much less of a Catholic connotation, much more of a kind of New Age spiritual one, especially when it's read in conjunction with Child's text, which quite explicitly describe Mussolini's spiritual qualities. And I think that these religious and spiritual allusions stood in quite distinct contrast to contemporary portraits of American men as materially minded and spiritually unfulfilled. I just want to make a few reflections before I move on what these American observers implied through these juxtaposed images of masculinity. I think most obviously they were using Mussolini as a kind of masculine ideal, so as a way to hold a mirror, not only up to American men, but also to the set of conditions that had seemingly destabilized manhood in America, namely industrialization, consumption, urbanization, and the loss of religious belief. But I would say also that their discourse wasn't just a pessimistic one about the United States. If they'd been using Mussolini purely as an embodiment of old-fashioned ideals in a sort of remote, distant, and impossibly traditional country, that might have been a way of saying that what he represented was unachievable. But they weren't doing that. Instead, they were situating him in a country that they insisted that he and his fascist regime were reforming and modernizing. So I think that these observers were also using Mussolini to send quite an optimistic or reassuring message to Americans, which was that the decadence of manhood wasn't an automatic outcome of modernity. And instead they were sort of suggesting that manliness and gender norms could be restored with the right leadership, policies, and institutions. And I'll turn now to some of these institutions, and particularly the institution of democracy. So after the First World War, there was a growing concern that the institutions of liberal democracy were really out of sync with contemporary conditions. And some of this related back to this idea that modern citizens were too busy to engage thoughtfully in politics, and that their lack of time and mental space meant that they were really unable to think about issues of public policy, particularly because those issues themselves were becoming increasingly complicated with modernity. And voter participation rates in elections in 1920 and 1924 were below 50%. And those low rates in themselves seem to suggest that democracy was of little interest or relevance to the average American. At the same time, critics believed that the introduction of new media was making it harder for ordinary people to form intelligent opinions. So while we might think now of radio as quite a stimulating medium, commentators at the time tended to think of it as quite dangerous, because they believed it made people very vulnerable to brainwashing and to groupthink. And this picture was published in one of Anna Hare McCormick's articles about the power of radio. And I think it captures this idea of radio as producing a disembodied voice that filtered into people's subconscious in a sort of powerful and potentially dangerous way. And that in itself made them even less capable of forming intelligent public opinions. There was also a growing sense that it wasn't only the public who were less and less capable of intelligent decision-making. Many pundits, including all of the four people whom I studied, repeated the idea that elected representatives weren't up to the task of legislating.
Did we just lose her? I think our connection is gone.
We lost the connection, huh?
Yeah.
No, it should be on then.
But she's frozen and you can't hear her. Sorry?
It might be on her end, hopefully she can log on. Because now I just, okay, now she should be on. she's off. She just got disconnected. She's getting connected again right now. Here you are. Here she is.
Occupational hazard. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. So here they often used metaphors of American government as a machine, but rather than a sort of lean and efficient machine, they described it as a lumbering and obsolete kind of machine. In this case, the machine almost seems to be doing damage to the citizens because the tank of democracy is kind of rolling down the steps of Congress, blind to the citizens that it crushes before it. So Charles, McCormick, Pope and Schneider were all fans of the fascist corporate state because they believed that it overcame the challenges of governance in the modern era. And Schneider spoke for all of them when he described the corporate state as the up-to-date state. So if we take the idea, for instance, that was circulating in America, that ordinary people weren't equipped to digest complex issues of public policy, fascist sympathizers suggested that they didn't really need to in the Italian system. But whereas we now, as historians or people who are knowledgeable about history, recognize that elections that were held under fascism were basically a total sham, these observers didn't characterize Italian elections that way. So for instance, in 1929, the regime instructed Italian men to participate in a plebiscite. And the question put before them was, did they approve of the corporate parliament that the fascist government had selected on their behalf? So it was a corporate parliament of 400 men that had been pre-chosen to represent all Italians. And all of these American observers welcomed this plebiscite as the kind of election that modern men and women were capable of participating in. So the plebiscite hadn't asked them to judge individual candidates, it hadn't asked them to digest policy issues. And so in that sense, they argued that it didn't ask them to engage in a high level of political thinking, but nor did they dismiss these elections as simple theatre. Instead, they interpreted them as a way of engaging Italians at a level that they could legitimately participate in and understand. And Herbert Schneider, for instance, praised the fascist regime for separating two different spheres that he believed ought to be separated in the United States, which was the mass participation in politics on one hand and elite decision-making on the other. And when it came to elite decision-making, Schneider argued that the fascists really had the hang of things. So he reproduced propagandist views of the corporate parliament as an institution that brought together sectoral specialists. So whereas democracy in the United States, as you know, is made up of congressmen and women who represent districts or entire states, the corporate parliament, in theory, was composed of sectoral experts who represented Italians according to their various economic interests. So in theory, it had experts in agriculture who could finely tune and finely craft agricultural policy, and it had experts in industry who could find the appropriate balance between the needs of workers and the desires of industrialists. So Schneider, as well as other fascist sympathizers, argued that that kind of fine-tuned and expert policy making was really lacking in the United States, but was a sine qua non of a modern state. And I think, you know, it's worth just reflecting a little bit what it was that these fascist sympathizers wanted for America. The short answer might be that it depends. For instance, Child for some time was so enamored by the Italian model that he suggested there would be no harm done in reducing the frequency of elections in the US. But McCormick, for instance, the New York Times journalist, took a much more inventive approach. In 1929, she wrote a long piece for the Times in which she pointed to the pros and cons of lobbying in the US. And on one hand, she criticized lobbying groups for having too much influence on policy making. But on the other hand, she recognized that they had the kind of sectoral expertise that senators and congressmen lacked. So McCormick actually suggested that the United States might be able to formalize lobbyists' roles by creating a parliament of lobbyists, which could draft sectoral specific legislation that then could be put before Congress. And so McCormick conceived of this sort of parliament of lobbyists as a parallel institution that would operate in addition to, but not instead of, Congress. And while the Italian corporate state was her reference point, she suggested that the United States could develop a sort of homegrown alternative to the corporate state that was much more reflective of American traditions. And after all, there's nothing much more American than a lobbyist. So that's just to say that these fascist sympathizers suggested that Italian-style corporate institutions didn't need to be grafted directly onto American democracy. Instead, they used the apparent success of the corporate state, and it was only an apparent success, to suggest reforms that would make American democracy better equipped for the modern age. And that they hoped that with these reforms, Congress would be able to pass legislation that was actually relevant for Americans. I'm hoping I've got enough time to get onto that legislation. Just stop me if I'm going on too long.
You're okay.
Okay, so by the early 1930s, of course, the need for new legislation was very urgent. Like many Americans, these observers interpreted the Great Depression as a product of over-industrialization. And this is an illustration which appeared in a Mccormick article, really sums up what they felt. So for them, the Great Depression was the end product of untrammeled modernity, which had enabled machines to take on a life of their own. And in this image, you see the machines taken on, human anthropomorphic qualities. He really seems to be beating men and women at their own game. And it's the American people as represented by Uncle Sam, who are totally overwhelmed by the size and the power of the machine, while in the background, the factories continue to smoke on. So you see here that these observers saw the Depression as kind of the end product of unfettered industrialization compounded by government neglect. By contrast, in fascist Italy, these same sympathizers saw a government that was active and responsive to the very same problems. In contrast to President Hoover in the early 30s, who seemed cold and disconnected from people's suffering, they saw Mussolini as a man who connected directly with his people and was responsive to their pain. But beyond that, at the policy level, they argued that fascist policies were ideally designed for a world that was in danger of being overwhelmed by machines. And fascist agricultural policy was of particular interest to McCormick, Pope, and Schneider. As some of you probably know, in the late 20s, the regime had begun a process of land reclamation in the south. And so by the 30s, it had relocated a couple of thousand families, mainly from northern towns, to these reclaimed areas. And needless to say, but I'll say it anyway, historians have pointed to a lot of problems in these policies of land reclamation and relocation, including that families who moved to those areas were heavily indebted. They weren't given access to land ownership, and actually often, despite the fact that they were growing wheat, they were starving hungry themselves and forced to eat carrion in some cases. But ignoring evidence of this kind, these Americans reconfigured Mussolini's agricultural policy as a kind of model response to the Depression. And in November 1932, fascist handlers took McCormick on a tour of the reclaimed marshlands. And she named the family that she met the Padovanis, meaning from Padua, And she claimed that this grouop of northern transplants was happy and very satisfied with their new life. And she described their compact, solid and simple new home, their hardworking days, the satisfying and nutritious meals they ate in the evening, and the community amenities such as a school and a church and a social centre that gave them a sense of connection with their neighbours. And Mccormick's article was, very much of a piece with other portraits of fascist policy during the Depression, because she emphasised how the government was using high-tech methods for very traditional ends. So what I mean by this is that she praised the technology that they had employed to dredge the marshlands and to reclaim the land, but she emphasised that the outcome had enabled Italians to return to the land, to rebuild their communities and to recover a more traditional way of life. And it was precisely these kind of policies that fascist sympathizers wanted FDR's administration to pursue. So here Mccormick and her peers were using apparently positive images from Italy as a way of guiding Roosevelt towards a particular set of policies. Specifically, they urged on the New Deal's program of subsistence homesteads, which were a very modest effort to resettle Americans in small communities with very low intensity, almost garden agriculture. And the subsistence homestead program's a lesser known part of the New Deal. I would say it's lesser known for good reasons, because it wasn't really a program that could be scaled up in a way that would help the majority of Americans. But it represented exactly the kind of project that these sympathizers hoped Roosevelt would initiate, because within the crisis, they actually saw an opportunity, which was to recalibrate the American economy and use machines as they imagined fascist Italy was using them, as servants rather than masters of men. So I'm going to leave space for some Q&A, but I hope that I've at least given you some insights into some of the reasons why Americans sympathize with Italian fascism. And I think you can see that from these examples I've given, that they were using fascism's apparent successes with managing the challenges of modernity in various ways. So first, they used them as a sort of foil or a mirror, which highlighted what was wrong with American politics and American life and culture. But second, they used fascism's success almost as a toolbox, in the sense that they reached to fascist Italy for examples of policies and institutions that might work in the US. And last, I would say that they used fascism to send a sort of therapeutic or essentially reassuring message about the possibilities of reconciling human needs with modern life.
Thank you very much, Katie. And you're well within 40 minutes, so there's lots of time for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to submit them. And there are some questions coming in. The first one, I'm just gonna, can you see them, Katie, yourself?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Did you want me just to answer, or are you gonna, manage it all?
I'll read it.
Yeah.
The question is from Jonas. Why was Mussolini a more popular figure in the United States over Hitler or Chiang Kai-Shek? And I think the suggestion here is that Hitler and Chiang Kai-Shek were both authoritarian figures, contemporaries of Mussolini.
Mm-hmm. I can say stuff about Hitler. I'm not really sure what I could say about Chiang Kai-Shek. I think that in terms of Hitler, it's Mussolini was around for much longer. So he was around and, the leader of Italy from the early 20s. And his program and his persona were increasingly totalitarian over time, but he didn't begin his government with the kind of extreme totalitarianism that it ended with before the Second World War and during the Second World War. The other thing would be that in the 1920s, his rise to power coincided with what I've described in terms of this deep ambivalence towards democracy. And if we think of someone like Walter Lippmann, you know, he wasn't a fascist sympathizer at all, but he was one of the many voices that was questioning the capacity of ordinary Americans to function effectively in a democratic institutional framework. So that in the 1920s, fascism had an appeal as a sort of alternative to democratic institutions, which it had begun to lose actually by the time that Hitler came along to some degree. The third reason would also be that in terms of extremism, Hitler was much more extreme, so that from the get-go, his policies were deeply objectionable to most Americans. I could talk for longer about this sort of Hitler-Mussolini nexus, because it was actually something that the people whom I studied really struggled with, and one of their main goals was to frequently distinguish Hitler from Mussolini and Mussolini from Hitler, because they knew that Hitler was very unpopular in America, and that they knew that insofar as Mussolini was tied in the public's mind to Hitler, then he wouldn't get much of a hearing among most Americans.
If I could just add something on Chiang Kai-Shek, which is off the I can't resist, and that is that he was a very popular figure in the United States. I mean, he had a highly organized and efficient lobby, including Time Magazine, Life Magazine. The publisher, Henry Luce, was a strong supporter. So he did have a considerable public support in the US, including long after his departure from the mainland in 1949. But getting back, should we take the next question?
Sure.
I'll read it. This is from Benson Chung. Is there anything that distinguishes these fascist sympathizers' interest in Mussolini from a more general interest in technocracy? Considering there was left-wing interest in authoritarian technocracies as well. The professor mentions H.G. Wells as an example.
Yeah, fascinating question. So I think that that's where the soul piece comes into the argument, that many of these people saw that fascism fulfilled technocracy in terms of having that sort of sectoral specialists and experts forming public policies, but they believed that it far exceeded technocracy in the way that it garnered people's emotions, right? So it wasn't just, I mean, it wasn't efficient government, but according to the discourse, it wasn't just efficient government. It was actually something much more, because it hit people on an emotional level and it occupied them in ways that just efficient technocratic government couldn't. And General So Pope's newspaper actually published articles about why Mussolini wasn't just a technocrat, right? And that's very much getting into this whole area that he fulfilled as a piece that was missing in people's emotional, almost spiritual landscape.
Katy, here's one that you might not be able to see. Came in over the chat function. See that one? Thank you for your, it's from Tommaso Milani. Thank you for your talk. Great to see the PhD has turned into a book. In your view, how well informed were these sympathizers about the actual policies of the regime, their real impact on Italian society? And did they engage with the work of anti-fascist exiles such as Salvemini, who denounced corporatism as a hoax? Of course, Salvemini was in the United States, anti-fascist.
Great question. It's a great question. No, they didn't. And yes, I did read some Salvemini, and you know, his critiques are very pointed, they're very accurate, and they were aware of him, certainly, and they were aware of these criticisms. And often what I was asking myself as I was reading some of what they wrote, in the positive things they wrote about fascist Italy, was the question, you know, to what degree were they true believers? And I think that more often than not, they were knowing participants in propaganda. And it came from them, from this, well, it came for a couple of reasons. One was sheer career or personal ambition, right? That for all of them, their relationship with Mussolini actually enabled them to advance in their careers. But I think less selfishly, that they were using these success stories as a way of prodding and pushing the United States. So that they were using it to make critical comments about America, to ask difficult questions about America. And more often than not, I don't think they really believed what they saw in fascist Italy, that it was more instrumental, their relationship with it. I'll say one more thing about that, which is when I was in Rome and I was researching in the Italian archives, I could then sort of see evidence of how Mccormick's journalism, how she used information that the regime funneled towards her in her journalism. And it was very fascinating what she did, and journalistically, obviously not at all kosher, because the 1930s coincided with a time where people really wanted, and if you think about the photography of Dorothea Lange, that people had, that there was this documentary impulse in culture in the 1930s, and this desire to hear ordinary people's stories, which is very much kind of a reaction to the horrors of the Great Depression. And what McCormick did was she would take the statistics that she got from the regime and she would weave them into personal stories. So rather than, you know, the regime would say average income is this. First of all, it wasn't that, but then she would say, I met this woman in Florence and she explained to me that her family's average income is this, right? So she kind of personalized everything as a way of making it feel really credible, but all she was doing was taking the information that the regime gave her. And my own belief is that she and Child certainly didn't really believe entirely what they were writing. They were using it more.
Okay, the next question is inviting you to reflect on the obvious comparisons or possible comparisons with the situation in the United States today. The question specifically is, does social media today have a role and impact similar to radio in the 20s? Presenting issues in a simplifying way. I guess what do you see as the comparisons and contrasts?
I do think that there's a really good comparison to be made. Where I find myself making it quite often is when everyone's freaking out about social media, which I'm far from an expert on in terms of my own lifestyle, but when everyone's sort of freaking out about how much it corrupts politics and corrupts our capacity to think clearly and to think for ourselves, I'll say, well, you know, they thought the same thing about the radio in the 1920s and 30s. So maybe, you know, there's a difference in the power of social media that means that the parallel isn't quite correct, and that social media is more dangerous than radio ever was. But I think that there's always there's a tendency to be very anxious about the effect of the media, right? And that it kind of comes in waves. You know, there was the radio, then there was TV, and everyone worries each time. But that maybe those mediums themselves adapt, and that, you know, society itself becomes a little bit more skeptical, and that enables us to become more questioning of the media, at least the majority of us. But it's a clear parallel, I would say.
Needless to say, the radio today is seen by some, and it certainly is an instrument of right-wing demagoguery in the United States.
Absolutely. You've got Rush Limbaugh and people like that. Absolutely. So it hasn't lost its power in that sense.
And it was also, of course, used very effectively by Roosevelt to advance the cause of the New Deal.
Right. And if I had another hour, I would have got into that, because that's something quite interesting that happened. And that when Roosevelt came along, one of the reasons why Mccormick simultaneously loved Roosevelt and Mussolini was very much this idea that both of them had taken technology and humanized it, right? And so Roosevelt's capacity to take this very alienating, what had been seen as an alienating form of media, and to actually use it as a way of reassuring people and humanizing his relationship with them, was like music to McCormick's ears, because it was exactly what she was looking for, someone who would take technology and make it human again.
Interesting. Here's a question from Giacomo Mazzei from Rome, from Sapienza. How did American sympathizers view fascist labor policy, and did their views change as American trade unions resurged in the 1930s?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of the labor policy, for instance, McCormick, because she had these instincts of Catholic social justice, she had a very optimistic view that the corporate state would manage the tensions between capital and labor in Italy, but she didn't investigate it deeply and find any problems, right? She was using it more as this idea that there was a solution. They were very, in the early Roosevelt years, these observers were very, very optimistic about the New Deal and the idea that the New Deal would bring many of the solutions that they were yearning for in American society, and not just an economic recovery, but much more this recalibration. And one of the things they also hoped for was that the National Recovery Act and accompanying legislation would enable a resolution of this ongoing tensions between capital and labor. So they were deeply disappointed in the late 30s by this recrudescence of labor unrest, because it for them was a sign that policies, that these problems weren't amenable to simple policy solutions. The Wagner Act had been passed in 1935, but it wasn't a sudden solution to the tensions between capital and labor. And so I think that it kind of was a turning point for them in realizing that here was Italy, and they created fascist Italy as this sort of imaginary place where the government created solutions and everything was solved. And then when Roosevelt came along and there was the New Deal, they had the same hopes for America, and those hopes were dashed when they saw the reality on the ground. So Italy was always for them this sort of canvas on which they could sort of paint an ideal world and hope that the same ideals would apply in the United States. But obviously reality hits harder in a democracy, right?
I know that prompts another question, which is, what do these people eventually become disillusioned with fascism? What I know you do tell that story in the book, but what happens to them? Do they stick with fascism to the end, or do they repudiate it? I mean,
yeah.
Run through the four individuals.
I will. Richard Washburn-Child died in 1935. He's an amazing character, and I loved reading his correspondence in the Library of Congress. He's really messy and deeply egotistical. And after Roosevelt got elected, he worked really hard to ingratiate himself with Roosevelt. And when he saw that he was a Republican, when he saw Roosevelt was going to get elected, he created this organization called the League of Republicans for Roosevelt. And they had big gatherings in New York as a way of bringing other Republicans over to vote for Roosevelt. And then he pushed very hard for Roosevelt to give him a good position, and Roosevelt wouldn't. And he married 4 times, which is quite unusual by the standards of the day, and died in 1935 of pneumonia. So he kind of petered out, I would say, and had an alcohol problem and didn't really have to engage all that much in the last couple of years with the fact that fascism was becoming more and more unpalatable. Herbert Schneider stopped writing about fascism after 1936 and sort of lied and denied how much he'd ever been a fan of it in later life. And then the two that have a much more kind of interesting trajectory, Mccormick and Pope. So Pope was under a lot of pressure as an Italian American, as Mussolini drew into a much closer relationship with Hitler, that Pope was put into a very uncomfortable position where he wanted to continue to be a loyal American who was an essential member of the Democratic Party and the American establishment, but that his continued defense of fascist Italy in his newspapers was putting him more and more into an uncomfortable spot. And the FBI started to investigate him in, I believe it was 1939, to see if he was actually a foreign agent on Mussolini's behalf. But it wasn't until the United States entered into the war in 1941, December 1941, obviously, that Pope came out very clearly with a statement of, "I'm now against fascism." Up until that point, he fudged all along the way and never really, he always tried to make a stronger distinction between Hitler and Mussolini, the one that really existed, and he never said anything that was outright condemnatory about Mussolini until he really had to, because of the beginning of the Second World War for the US. The last chapter of my book goes into some detail of how Pope handled, following 1938, Italian racial laws, which were obviously anti-Jewish laws, and the degree to which he minimized them and sort of hid the news deep within the pages of his newspaper, in a way that, I mean, there is criticism about how American press responded to anti-Semitism in Europe, or anti-Semitism in the United States for that matter, but the difference between how Pope was handling Italian racial laws and how, say, the New York Times or the Atlanta Constitution were handling Italian racial laws is really quite remarkable. McCormick played a very, very subtle game, so that she continued to write articles that would seem to be palatable to the regime, but that were actually also critical of it, but in ways that they wouldn't necessarily understand, until that brought her to a breaking point with the Italian regime. And that was in about 1940. At the same time, she had quite a close relationship with Roosevelt at that point, so he was using her for influence in Italy. And he sent her to Italy with the hope. So Sumner Wells went to Italy, was it February 1940? Sumner Wells went to Italy to try and convince Italy to stay neutral in the Second World War. And the month before Sumner Wells' trip, McCormick went and she tried to meet with Mussolini, and Mussolini would no longer meet with her at that point. But before she left, she met with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt asked her, please try and convince the regime to stay neutral in the Second World War. So she was kind of working as a bit of an unofficial ambassador, somewhat ineffectually, up until 1940. And like Pope, like all of these people, very big layers of denial about their fascist sympathies. She never reckoned with them. She never really acknowledged them. She wrote very little about Mussolini after 1940, and never any sort of sense of, well, sort of telling the story of how she'd fallen out of love. She just kind of preferred to forget it had ever happened. She went on to be, both she and Pope actually went on to be very active Cold Warriors. So I think in that sense, they tried to make their peace with the United States establishment as becoming very strong anti-authoritarian, anti-totalitarian figures within the US.
You know, anti-communism is a theme that you don't put too much emphasis on, but of course,
no.
Maybe because it goes without saying.
It goes without saying, but they didn't say it very often. So
Mussolini was not seen as the savior. The attraction of Mussolini was not that he was the savior of Italy from communism.
Not particularly for them, no. So in the early 1920s, really, when they were very attracted to fascist squads, it wasn't, they talked about how they were saving Italy from communism, but actually some of them were somewhat cynical about that and believed that Italy had saved itself, or that the communists had petered out on their own accord. And what they were much more interested in about the fascist squads was their violence. They found their violence very attractive and appealing because it kind of gave them this sense of élan vital, I guess would be the word. And also they really configured these fascist squads as a revival of wartime ideals, because in the early 20s in the US, there was a sense of post-war malaise, a lot of disillusionment, a return to private life and private values and consumerism. And they configured these fascist squads more as public-oriented, service-minded young men who were willing to fight for their country. So that was where they put their attention rather than on the anti-communist side of the story. Of all four of them, Mccormick was the only one who put some attention on anti-communism, but not much.
Davide Tabarelli would like to know if you have read Bruno Vespa's book,
No.
Why Italy Loved Mussolini.
No, I'll read Bruno Vespa.
Those of you who don't know.
Check that out. He's a journalist, right?
If you haven't, there's one to add to your list.
Yeah.
So the next two questions are similar. They wanted, well, I'll just read them. Have you seen a similar trend in 21st century America recently? In other words, what kind of influence do authoritarian leading figures, Orban, Putin, I guess Erdogan, et cetera, have on American political thought? I mean, what do they have an appeal today?
Mm-hmm.
The next question is a similar question. Thanks for, this is from Sophie Hasplag, if I've pronounced that correctly. Thanks for a fantastic talk. So are you arguing that the fascist fascination was present across the US political spectrum? And what elements of your analysis are still relevant in US politics today? So I guess they're asking you to reflect again on
the contemporary
kind of predilection in the US among circles for foreign authoritarian leaders, mentioned domestic authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, I think that there are certain conditions that encourage an appeal of authoritarianism in a contemporary context as well. So rather than kind of drawing direct parallels between Mussolini and Trump, say, I would say that the economic dislocation that has occurred in the US since the 1970s with deindustrialization, and the sense that a class of people who were once very much in the center of American society and culture, which would be men working in industry with unionized jobs and union wages, that class has lost so much relative power in America, and with it a kind of an accompanying sense of their own embattlement has created conditions that make authoritarian leadership appealing in the United States. So if I look at it more in a sort of systemic way, then yes. In terms of personalities, I mean, we could draw some superficial parallels between Trump and Mussolini, but I think that that's less compelling than actually seeing why authoritarianism, why and when authoritarianism appeals in the US. In terms of Orban and Putin, I don't know. I mean, I know that Trump was a fan of them, but he was a fan of them for obvious reasons, right? Does the average American have much interest in Orban and Putin? I don't know.
Nor the average. This is from David Elwood, our colleague. What do you think of Margarita Sarfati's impact in America?
Mm-hmm. Well, she...
Sarfati was.
Yeah, so she was Mussolini's mistress. And she was very active in helping him with his propaganda. And I mean, I know, for instance, that she essentially authored his autobiography, so child edited it, but it was Margherita Sarfati who was the writer behind his autobiography. And I saw lots of her writing that would come up, for instance, in Il Progresso, they would publish her work. But in terms of her broader influence, I'm not too sure.
For those of you who don't know, we're talking about Mussolini's longtime mistress.
Mm-hmm.
And when did they split up? Must have been before the racial laws came into effect.
Yeah.
There's the second part of David's question is, was it because of Margherita Sarfati that Eleanor Roosevelt told McCormick of her distaste for Mussolini?
I don't know. David seems to know a lot about this topic, but I don't know about this one.
I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
Here's another question about Mussolini. It has been said that if Mussolini had died at a more propitious time in history, such as right after his victory in Ethiopia,
Mm-hmm.
he might be hailed today as one of Italy's top leaders.
Yeah, I mean, by whom?
I'm just reading the question.
Yeah, but I mean, no, just, who would hail him as one of Italy's top leaders? I guess, even up until 1936, he'd done a lot of terrible things. It got worse for sure, but even what was considered at the time some of his wonderful reforms have been picked away at by historians and been shown to be fairly empty and to have quite ambiguous effects in terms of economic outcomes, right? And partly why I said by whom is that obviously conquering Ethiopia for some Italians was a very popular stance, and it was made good on history and the Battle of Adwa, but I don't think that the Ethiopians would agree that he would be Italy's best leader, right? So there were a lot of people who suffered from a human rights perspective and a personal perspective under this regime before the Second World War.
Okay, the questions are arriving fast and furious. I hope we have time to answer it all. The next one is, thank you, Dr. Hall, for your illuminating talk, and congratulations on your book. As you have defined in your book, Fascism fulfilled a seemingly efficient and technologically advanced system that upheld tradition, religion, and family. How then do you see gender as an expectation and advocates of religion and the state being separated then fit in, or rather contradict with, if you read.
Okay, I'm going to look for this one. Yeah, it's getting complex. Okay. Sorry, I shouldn't have made you do all the work. That was bad of me. Oh, how do I get down there?
From Sneha Mahapatra.
Okay. Find my little scrolly thing. Okay, here we are. Seemingly efficient and technologically advanced system that upheld tradition, religion, and family. Nicely summarized. How then do you see gender as an expectation, advocates of religion and the state being separated, then fit in, or rather contradict with? And the challenge, sorry, I'm just struggling to understand. And the challenges that these unauthored, you just punted this to me because you don't understand it. Now you're trying to make me understand it. Okay. And the challenges that these unorthodox values pose to how the machine modernity affect information production, generation, and or propaganda. Sneha, could you rephrase the question, please?
It's slightly prolix.
I can't do it.
Yeah, we'll ask you to rephrase it too.
Please rephrase your question and I will answer it with all the power of my brain.
The next one, actually, this is the last on the list, my list. Does your research suggest that fascism is primarily defined as a kind of political economic development model? Do you see parallels between these interwar sympathies and today's discourses about the Chinese model, offering an alternative, effective alternative to liberal democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Are there parallels there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I guess there are parallels in that I think that any of these models being held up as alternatives stimulate sometimes productive conversations actually in America about, what's good and what's bad in the United States and what could be improved on. I would say that the way that the questioner phrased the question is fascism is sort of, it kind of gets back to that question about technocracy, right? That it was more than that for these people as well. It wasn't just efficient system of government. It wasn't just an efficient system of economic management in their mind. It was neither of those things in reality, but in their mind, it wasn't just those things. It was also something that affected people emotionally and spiritually. And I don't think we see that conversation about the Chinese model currently, if I'm not mistaken, right? So I think that insofar as every so often parallel alternatives come up and scholars or pundits start saying, is American democracy in crisis, and are there threats to our democracy offered by alternative models? Insofar as that can be a kind of productive and constructive conversation about what needs to be improved in our democratic institutions, then I think that's great. I think one of the problems with those kind of conversations is that often we argue with only half the information available to us, right? And that was something that very much happened with these observers, that they weren't comparing equal entities, and that they had all the information at their disposal that they wanted about the United States, that it was basically a transparent democracy, and it was there to be seen, warts and all. And they compared that to a state that manipulated and managed its image in a not at all a watertight way, certainly not, but in a way that at least enabled them to present a much cleaner and neater image of fascism that actually existed. And I think that there's a danger there with the kind of Chinese model as well, that what we're talking about when we talk about the Chinese model is the tip of the iceberg of what's going on in China. And again, we can kind of get back to the human rights question, right? That a lot of that gets unsaid if we think about the Chinese model.
I was hoping that Sia would rephrase her question.
Yeah, because it looked like a great question. I got the first half, but I couldn't do the second.
We have a little time left if we want to use it. Why not? Was there a mass fascist movement in the United States? I mean, was fascism popular at the grassroots among Italian Americans?
Yes.
The people who read Generoso Pope's newspaper, after all.
Yeah, I would say that it was certainly popular among Italian Americans, and that's got a lot to do with the way Italian Americans were being treated in the United States, right? So that to have their home country or their country of origins being looking successful, looking like it was a successful modernizer, was a huge thing to be proud of for Italian Americans. And really by 1936, with the conquest of Ethiopia, the only group that consistently supported fascism in the United States after 1936 was Italian Americans.
Okay, well, I think, Katy, that has really been interesting. We could go on, and it would be fascinating to have a whole new session on the possible parallels with the situation in the United States today.
Yeah.
but I think you've earned your whatever it is you're running. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get a glass of wine with us
I'm
afterwards.
going to get one upstairs.
One upstairs, yeah. And by the way, you're coming to us from Vienna,
Yeah.
correct? Yeah. Or maybe a piece of sacro torte too.
Yeah. Nah, just 2 glasses of wine.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm glad it's really a shame that you couldn't come down.
I know.
Come down soon as soon as this whole thing is over, which it will be.
Yeah, we'll do it soon.
Great to see you. And thank you very much for a stimulating talk, and good luck with the book.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thank you for everything.
I'm sure it'll have great reviews. Okay,
Maybe if you write one.
be happy to. Bye.
Ciao.
Everyone.